think at this point, I will turn it over to Taylor Nelms to say a bit more about the series and then to introduce today's speaker. Taylor?
Thanks so much, Bill. Thanks everybody for being here. We're really deeply excited and honored that we get to have this conversation today with Dr. Mary L. Gray. Mary is the Senior Principal Researcher at Microsoft Research and an Associate Professor at the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing and Engineering, Anthropology, and Gender Studies at Indiana University, as well as a Faculty Associate at Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. She's authored, co-authored, and edited a whole bunch of stuff, and I won't read you her entire CV, but most recently, she's the co-author of Ghost Work, How to Stop Silicon Valley from Building a New Global Underclass, and before that, the author of Out in the Country, Youth, Media, and Queer Visibility in Rural America. Mary is also, as many of you already know, one of this year's MacArthur Fellows, recognized for her work on digital technologies and economies. So we're really excited to have the opportunity to talk with Mary today about the past, present, and future of public scholarship. And really, like all of our guests, there's no one better positioned with the experience and background to have this conversation with us. So we're looking forward to it. Later on, we will be joined by 3 PhD students, Kim Fernandez from the University of Pennsylvania, Nina Medvedeva from the University of Minnesota, and Nima Yolmo from the University of California, Irvine, who are here to keep us honest in anything that we happen to say over the first half hour, 45 minutes or so. We do want to thank the Wintergren Foundation and the UCI School of Social Sciences for their support for this series. And we want to remind you that we will be able to answer your questions. So please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. And we'll be keeping track of those to ask towards the end of the hour. And also just a reminder that cart captioning is available, live cart captioning is available. And thanks to Joshua Edwards for providing that service here today. So, maybe we'll just start by asking Mary to tell us a little bit about, what you do and how you ended up doing the work that you're doing.
Well, thanks for the invitation. This is definitely a crowd of people I would love to be sitting in a room with, chatting and maybe swapping some gossip. And, my origin story, my path is a bit peculiar, but then I think we all find ourselves often part of peculiar paths when we're bridging these worlds of universities and other settings that appreciate scholarship. So I started out as a queer youth organizer. I wanted to understand how could we be using the internet to the best of our ability to do different kinds of politics in places like the rural parts of the United States, places I came from. It wasn't terribly complicated or theoretically heavy. It was, what difference does the internet make anyway? And I started asking that question not too long after I left my undergraduate. I finished my undergraduate degrees in anthropology and Native American studies. I wasn't very good at school, so I couldn't have gone into a grad program if I wanted to. But I was doing this political work, and I also had become a member of a startup called Planet Out. And I realized that I felt like I didn't have the frameworks to help me understand whether I was asking the right question or not. So I was in an anthropology master's program, very much a part of the world of queer anthropology at the American Anthropological Association. And when I asked people, should I go on to anthropology? Enough of them said, don't bother. You'll never really find a career path in anthropology if you want to study technology, young people, and rural parts of the United States. So I actually never left anthropology in many ways, but my formal training is at a communication department in San Diego. And that's the project that started me on a path that led to a tenure track position. I trained like anybody does in graduate school to narrow my ambitions and think about an academic career. And I found myself fortunate to match with an academic position at Indiana University, which is a wonderfully peculiar, quirky public institution that's mostly liberal arts. And when I finished the research for Out in the Country and published that book, I got tenure, and I really wondered, how can I make technology matter? I was still asking the same question. So it was just serendipitous in many ways that Microsoft Research, which is, I believe now kind of the last institution standing that affords academic freedom to its researchers, invited me to join them as a permanent researcher. And I've been there for 8 years.
So can you tell us a little bit, Microsoft Research, the last institution standing, tell us a little bit about your perspective on kind of what kind of organization Microsoft Research is, and not just in terms of culture, but, structurally, and, what's the history of those kinds of institutions, especially in the tech world?
Yeah, I mean, the tech world has had these really interesting points of reference. Bell Labs is heralded as the institutional foregrounder. You could think of Xerox PARC as another place that from its earliest days was working with technologies and thinking about technologies as somehow having something to do with society. But those earliest labs, for the most part, imagine they were designing closed systems, often designing objects, things, and then people would pick them up. We could probably make a case they were social all along, but the history of those early industry-based labs in technology spaces was rooted in the disciplines that were growing up alongside it. So I think what's very interesting to me about a place, particularly Microsoft Research, is that from its earliest founding, it was feeding the disciplines of computer science, which mostly was this weird thing in electrical engineering departments, and the field of engineering that was starting to build things other than bridges. So, the collision of that, of an industry that absolutely needs foundational research to grow, was the greenhouse for Microsoft Research. It also could afford to basically lock, stock, and barrel grab tenured faculty. Just like all conservative institutions in academia, it just grabs the most accomplished tenured faculty rather than nurturing emerging scholars. So it took that methodology and created Microsoft Research. And I think what's unique about it is that it, from the very beginning, had always had this rotating door to academia. It didn't see the conflict, except when it came to intellectual property. So there are very clear expectations around, if you create code, what you do with it. And I think that has profound implications for how we think about social media companies as research centers now. What are the constraints and the possibilities there for feeding academic work, foundational scientific inquiry?
And we'll definitely come back to that question, because I think it's a really, really important one. But maybe let's dig just a little bit deeper on kind of your day-to-day work. So can you tell us about kind of what a day in the life of Mary Gray looks like? And maybe in particular, I think we're interested in what are the other kinds of labor, right? Maybe recognized or not so recognized, involved in working at a place like Microsoft Research, right? Institution building labor, mentorship, organizational maintenance, admin. Tell us a little bit about that work.
Sure. And actually, it's interesting because I think the kind of work I do day to day probably increasingly looks like the work that you probably do, Taylor, but in settings where, the interest is either private sector, public sector investment in opening up questions. Those kinds of spaces also ask of us to nurture lines of inquiry, research agendas, mentoring as part of that. So my day-to-day, it looks a lot like what I did at my university. It means I'm talking with students about their research projects, offering them support about everything from readings to navigating their methodology. The service load is a very interesting mix of teaching and service in that I have colleagues who have never heard of anthropology or have a very rudimentary understanding of social sciences. So they might use the term social and they just mean co-present. So they assume that there's nothing social about being alone. And that, my work, the service load is to bring the epistemologies, the ways of knowing the world from my training to their day-to-day work life, which is often just trying to build something or evaluate something they've tried to build. So that's a piece of the service load, but it's really teaching and service. I find myself now offering kind of critical gender studies and critical race studies in my day-to-day conversations with colleagues, in the same way that if I was teaching undergraduates an internet and society course, that's what they'd be learning about for the first, usually 2 weeks of class. So it's a really wonderful day-to-day. Microsoft Research is, again, somewhat unique in that next semester I'm going to be co-teaching a course with a colleague who's a mathematician at MIT. That's a part of my day job. That's not something I have to do on the side. I write, I'm expected to write, I'm expected to publish. There's not so much perishing in this world, so that's good. But I still have the expectations that I'm going to communicate what I've learned. That is my day-to-day.
On that point, could you actually say a bit more about the different modes and registers of those communications and who they're for? Because I know you have to navigate among a number of different kinds of constituencies in this position, as well as, right back to the academic world. So just a bit more about those modalities and communities.
Yeah, it's, the white paper has been replaced by PowerPoint that's actually more of a video conversation. So communicating internally might look like I'm going to produce a short video for you that's a tutorial on how to rethink on-demand labor. So that's a really interesting shift, that writing and really having luxury of writing a long piece doesn't really serve this environment well, because there are many folks who need to be able to digest materials quickly. What I actually really love about that is it forces me to constantly translate. I don't think there's anything that I'm arguing or that I study that can't be made accessible. It's just a lot of work to do that. And in an academic setting, I have the luxury of not having to do that. I can just exchange tokens of phrases, and we can just enjoy saying, neoliberal without talking much more. I actually really relish how much I can't get away with using any language that carries its own freight. Every word has to count in a different way. But the modalities are also options. So, does that look like for me, it's increasingly looked like writing public op-eds, which in a university setting, maybe I might be incented to do that. Maybe I wouldn't care to do that, but here, I have room to make that one of the modalities. And then lastly, just on that point, I feel like I really get a chance to reflect on what is it that I don't like about journal articles. I really struggle with journal articles as an interdisciplinary writer or scholar, because it's humbling. I'm quite insecure as a writer. It means I have to learn how that journal's readers expect me to speak. And I'm not very good about that. So it's been a real pleasure to learn where do I want to place essay length pieces? What do I think about the performance of a particular voice? What are my motivations for singing in that register? And I feel like it's given me a place to interrogate, like, when you're coming up, there aren't very many options. You have to have those publications, those journal publications. What would it be like if that wasn't the coin of the realm for coming up through an academic career? I wonder about that.
And as you think about these different modalities, I mean, first of all, Filene, where I'm at, the think tank where I'm based, we haven't moved past the PowerPoint deck. So I'm looking forward to the moment where we can communicate internally via short, 2 to 5 minute videos about X topic. But as you think about those different modalities, who are you trying to influence, or what kinds of impacts are you trying to have on those people? Are there, do you imagine that there are different categories of kind of constituents that you're trying to shape in different ways, or how do you approach that question?
I mean, for my work, and I'm sure this is true for others on this conversation, I know that there are several audiences I could reach, and I'm greedy. I want to reach them all. So I'm often trying to think, like, if I take ghost work, for example, the most recent work I did with computer scientist Siddharth Suri, that work is meant to speak to entrepreneurs who are going to create the startups that could be thinking very consciously about the work they're producing and distributing. Reaching engineers who are building those platforms and thinking about algorithmic management, but not thinking they're managing people. That's an audience. Public policy people who actually don't often understand how technologies work at all. It's quite stunning to me that it's still really hard to convince people, particularly with this face, that no, in fact, artificial intelligence doesn't work the way we're told it works. So those are all different audiences, but being able to find a way to speak to them and in many ways use the same words, but perhaps emphasize different parts of what I'm saying. That to me is the work that I can do here, that I really can put energy into those different constituencies. So my audiences here at Microsoft Research are often the software engineers, the day-to-day developers, but also their managers who need to give them space to think differently about their responsibilities as builders. It's making a case that that's worthwhile. And ultimately, actually, at the end of the day, I'm more interested in meeting the students who are going to populate these companies. So I want to reach undergrads, grads who are, year 1, year 2 of their programs and are going to be the recruits for these companies. Because if you change what they expect, then none of these companies can hire someone who doesn't hold higher expectations than they currently have.
And so there's a kind of story that you're telling, I think, and maybe I'll just kind of talk it through with you and see if we're on track, and then I have a kind of question. So there's a way in which you have a kind of external audience, kind of a broader public audience that includes public policymakers and the people that influence them, that includes entrepreneurs and engineers who are building stuff out in the world, and includes, there's a general public there too, especially in the kind of op-ed work that you do. And then there's that internal audience, right, at Microsoft Research. And then there's this kind of the student audience, right, that, is really, really compelling to hear you talk a little bit about the power of changing companies by changing their recruiting pool, so to speak, right? I wonder, if you could reflect a little bit on the role of, if there is a role for kind of community building in the communication that you have with these different groups. You started this story by telling us that you came up through political organizing, queer political organizing, right? And there is a really profound kind of community building that happens. And so I wonder if you might reflect on those kind of two different modes of community building, and are there similarities? What are the differences? And I have a follow-up question, but maybe talk a little bit about that first.
I love that question because I realize like the work I'm doing right now, like since literally March 5th, has been working with this team called the Pandemic Response Network. And it's a group out of North Carolina. We've been working nonstop trying to think, well, how would you better equip community healthcare workers? What would it take to be able to bring systems built around their workflows to address COVID-19, but more broadly be able to create an extension of public health, to build out the public health that particularly in the United States we do not have. I mean, that is a political question for me. It's on fire for me. And at the same time, it is precisely saying the domain experts missing from what we build right now are community organizations and communities hardest hit by COVID-19. Everybody is assuming what individual patients might need, and they have this odd abstraction of who gets sick, even though the preponderance of data is it's disenfranchised, historically marginalized communities. So if they're not at the table, and this is certainly a iteration of, not, don't build it without us, that chant, I'm a relentless optimist. I do believe that there's something profound that could happen if our approach to building technologies was assuming the technology will never be right. There's nothing that technology can fix about society's problems. But if we were to engage communities as participants and collaborators in what we build, we more quickly see what's being built against their interests. So, I chair the Microsoft Research Ethics program here. It's the only federally registered institutional review board in a tech setting. And the reason I am doggedly holding on to making that program live is because it is a possibility of imagining what it looks like to assume you're always interacting with people when you build social technical systems. I actually hate that phrase because it's been picked up so quickly. But whenever you're building technologies that are going to become ubiquitously a part of people's everyday lives, you're interacting with them as much as I am when I go in to do field work. So what would it look like to assume that and take on the responsibilities of building around that premise? That's what I'm trying to do with the Pandemic Response Network, and more broadly, convening these different interlocutors that I imagine with my scholarship is precisely to say there should not be such distance between a software engineer and the African-American churches that we're working with in Durham. There's not a good argument for why they're assumed to be so far apart. They actually need each other. So what would a kind of mutuality to that relationship look like?
I wonder in those sorts of moments of trying to build these new kinds of connections and relationships, how you really convey this, especially to the technology side, who I imagine are going to go straight to gee whiz tech solutionism, right? Like with innovation and disruption, we can fix it, we can do it. And how do you kind of slow down, calm down? Now let's really have a time to hear what people are trying to tell you. How do you do that?
Bill, like the most helpful thing has sadly been a historical racial uprising and a pandemic. Like it takes that kind of shock, and I actually hear the language of shock quite a bit these days. I think that has made my work a little less hard, because I do think I entered this space 8 years ago thinking it wouldn't be so hard to convince people it's not the technology. And I feel naive in saying that out loud now. But what has changed is everything around us showing the failure of continually throwing tech at something and seeing its shortfall. It doesn't mean people stop trying. I mean, to your point, there's still this, oh, but maybe it'll work in this situation. So but where I'm most hopeful is when I talk with graduate students, particularly in computer science and engineering, they get that that's not working. They really do. Not all of them, but enough of them that I actually can imagine we're on the, we could be at a place where we can rethink what are the social sciences and what would it look like to include computer science under that shingle.
Yeah, and this really touches on a question that we've gotten in the Q&A, and a question that I have about, in your work today, you've hinted at this, you've talked a little bit about it, but how does Microsoft Research, or how do you kind of nurture emerging scholars, young scholars, students, and who would you consider to be your fellow travelers? That's a kind of theme that we've had kind of throughout our conversations. Someone in our very first conversation said that they misheard it as fellow troublers, which we also really like. But if you could, kind of categorize some of those fellow travelers, people that you're kind of working with, who would those people be?
Yeah, let me start with that last question, because I want to say I'm so appreciative of being able to work with Barbara Gross. She's a computer scientist. She was a pioneer in natural language processing, truly multi-agent systems. And she, until recently, was on faculty at Harvard. She's retired, and she's co-chairing a National Academy's study on computer science and engineering's ethical responsibilities. So what I appreciate, and I'm holding her up as this key fellow traveler, is that she is someone with incredible curiosity, who has clear disciplinary training and knows the limits of that training and sees the value of convening a kind of a creation of an interdisciplinary space that sees the complementarity of disciplines and isn't looking to co-opt one discipline to serve computer science. So she's such a model in my mind for what would it look like to move forward so that we keep the strength of disciplinarity. Because I would be the first to say, I stayed as much as I could in anthropology to keep my feet to the fire, so that I would always have a group of people who would call out, you're not really holding the rigor of this approach. And it's so critical that we have that kind of disciplinary strength to bring to these interdisciplinary problems, rather than, jockeying for which discipline is going to figure it all out. Like, those aren't the kinds of problems we have, if they ever were. So she's my fellow traveler. And there are many graduate students, there are a few on the call, who I consider, hopefully they consider me, maybe I'm in the backseat with them, but now I have Driving Miss Daisy picked in my head. That's sad. But I genuinely hope that the fellow travelers are other scholars who take very seriously the rigor of what they do, and have the humility to recognize the limits of what they can offer and what they can't. But I think I lost track of the first part of your question.
No, that's actually great. I think that you've touched on both of those, and maybe that actually provides a nice transition point for us to be thinking about, the public-facing social science that you do, interdisciplinary social science that you do, and many of your colleagues do as well. What are the possibilities in your mind? And, if there were some of the kind of key limitations that you've run up against, I wonder what those are too.
Yeah, I think the key possibilities here are that we would see that for particularly critical scholarship, and by that I mean scholarship meant to call out inequity as constitutive of the spaces we hold in the world. That there, a theory of power that would just go with the analysis of society and technology's relationship to it, so that we can work with that assumption, start with that assumption. And that is an assumption. It's, the qualifier to what we're doing. But if I start there, the possibilities are to shift out of the gee whizness that Bill had referenced and be able to move to an interrogation of the conditions under which we find people in the world and what we want to change about those conditions. That we would stop thinking in terms of externalities as though you can carve up things into clean, causal statements. And we would really be able to contend with the dynamism that is social life, that you don't find answers. You just continually pick away at what are the problems? How have we come to decide which problem counts most? And that we would literally say, and some folks are gonna go and work on that problem, and always be willing to say, gosh, I've sharpened, I've narrowed my view, and I've lost sight of the other problems I'm generating by the way I approach what it is I want to fix in the world. So it's not giving up on there ever being a way of building something. It's the opposite of that. It's saying whatever I built has to be constantly in conversation and iterating with, what do I know about the world? What are the differences, the groups that are out there that are not being addressed? And that you just don't stop asking that. There's no relief from asking that, and that's okay. And the limits are going to be that people get sick of doing that. That people say, I'd like a quick fix. So I'd really like some health communication that tells me how to get people to take vaccines. And that becomes the problem statement. And then we're stuck with this diminished sense of how different people are and how much their lives matter to how we consider what we need to do to meet what's not working in their world. If you can't tell, this is actually me quite exasperated and angry.
I can't tell. Actually, you sound way more optimistic than I would sound talking about these things. But I mean, this is incredibly powerful already. I wonder if maybe, as I think about what you've said, and Bill, feel free to jump in here too, but there is this kind of alternating modality, right? An alternating modality between the kind of never letting up about the pressure, allowing yourself to be pressured by the communities that your work is touching and the reality that they live, and the moment of, let's give people a tool that they can act on, right? Or a pathway that they can follow, right? Something digestible. I don't want to say simple because it's not that, but there is this kind of alternating where, you can give people something and then, keep hold of that something and be able to keep it in touch with the world at the same time. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, what role, maybe that something is technological, right? That thing you can offer people to act on. So are there roles for technology in addressing social problems, and what, maybe think through what those might be?
Well, you just landed on my favorite role for technology, Taylor, which is that it's a prompt. It's a prompt for thinking, what am I thinking? What are the assumptions that I'm making right now that are going to foreclose this being useful to someone else? Because it's that question that's actually the more valuable part of all of this. So, I mean, again, I think the reason that Barbara Gross or other colleagues that I consider fellow travelers are so critical to this, this sea change that we desperately need within the worlds I'm traveling, it's because they're willing to concede, oh, technology isn't the fix here, but it can do some good. It's just letting it be a little bit of good instead of a solution. And the little bit of good is to open up space for us to start interrogating, who and what am I leaving behind? Who is benefiting here? And I'm hoping that somebody on the call will call out, like, look where I work. I work at Microsoft. So, my job here is to constantly call out what is the conflicting tension between a capitalist imperative and what good technologies could do in the world, because there's a constant conflict. And it's not about resolving that conflict. It's saying that conflict's going to be there. So what do we do with that conflict? Again, theory of power for me is there's no outside of capitalism I'm not looking for the, the side door, this like magical, beautiful capitalist free world. I don't believe that will exist in my lifetime. I fear what it would look like to try. Maybe I'm meek in that way. But what I am looking for are for us to note that technology companies and information societies, which are basically information service work, like that is our economy globally. Really, that is the engine of our economy. So if we thought about the exchange of information and communication as an economic zone, how would we populate that zone with an awareness that, gosh, what a different orientation to productivity, to all the, all the terms we throw around that to me are opportunities to say, oh, people's contributions are incredibly valuable. Oh, anything we're creating is actually collectively an aggregation, a collective contribution. Oh, that should change everything we do about how we compensate people, how we recognize people, how we value people. Like all of that is possible even within a company, at least within this company.
You're reminding me very much of something that I can't remember who said it, either Jane Geyer or Jean Lave, about how, we're not after solutions, but resolutions, and resolution kind of in the sense of like a New Year's resolution, right? I will now recommit and affirm to my values, which are X, Y, and Z, which isn't going to solve a problem, but as you said, is going to help us pick away at the problem and then help us see the new problems. I think we're about to transition now to where our grad students, Nina, Nima, and Kim, are going to jump in and start posing some questions to you, but also some questions that have popped up in the Q&A field in the chat. And if the other folks attending want to add in some questions, please feel free. Just go down to the bottom of your screen, click on the Q&A balloon and type away. And Nina, Nima, and Kim, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Bill. Hi, Mary. So I guess I'll just kind of ask the first question, specifically with regard to sort of the possibilities that corporations present for research, and maybe also some of the, I'm going to use the word fragile, you might not characterize it as fragile, but some of the fragility in these interdisciplinary collaborations. And I'm thinking specifically here to Google AI and the firing of Dr. Timnit Gebru, and sort of, I was wondering if you can speak to how you navigate that tension at Microsoft, if that's like a tension that is just inherently there, and then how do you make sure that you're building a company culture that can, embrace and put forward someone like Dr. Gebru instead of firing them and trying to silence them?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought it up because it's definitely on my mind. It's on a lot of the minds of colleagues in my world. So thank you for bringing that up. And it gives me a chance to touch back to something Taylor had raised, that I think supporting emerging scholars is precisely as more established scholars being loud, making room, taking risks because we can afford to. So it frustrates me that emerging scholars are the ones absorbing so much of the heat and taking stands that their more established colleagues are not better able to take those stands, but owe it to make room because again, they can afford it. So, I think what's distinct, and I'm frustrated to realize that Microsoft Research, at least the labs that I'm affiliated with, so I don't even want to speak for all of Microsoft Research, the value proposition, if you will, is academic freedom. And it is the thing that we can offer researchers who could otherwise go to Google or Facebook or somewhere else and get access to more data, but would then have a vetting process. So let me just say loud and publicly, as much as this is as public as it gets, Microsoft Research doesn't vet research. It doesn't have a process where you have an internal review board review your written material. It assumes that the only review you need is an ethics review before you start your work, and any security reviews that go with releasing software on the world. But otherwise, peers at other institutions are the ones who are domain experts who would be able to evaluate the strength of the scholarship. So I would argue what the public needs is the commitment that researchers at institutions like mine are underwriting the foundational research that's going on in institutions like yours. Now, that can take a lot of different shapes. So it can be PhD internships that are really good supportive internships that have academic freedom for those who take on those internships, and they ask the questions they see as important to ask. I think there's an incredible role for industry-based research to play a part in underwriting the scholarship they are going to profit from. So right now, universities are not getting a fair exchange. And if we're not careful, we're going to find ourselves where biomedicine is today, which is having a hard time making sure that it has the basic science in place in universities to train who's going to be their next bench scientist. We can't afford to keep doing that. And it's peculiar to the United States, I would say, maybe not so much, but that our higher educational institutions are not better funded by private industries that profit from them is appalling. So that's about the defunding of public institutions and thinking they're private goods. They're not private goods. They benefit our economy, they benefit the public. So we need to stop this shit of thinking it's an individual investment. And that starts with, yes, our tax dollars, but those tax dollars should also be coming from corporations. So you can probably tell I have a little bit of anger about that one. But I think there are other things that, particularly when it comes to products and services that are going to have an impact on society, and I think we could probably come up with some litmus tests for that, there needs to be oversight. There has to be public governance. There has to be space for the public to deliberate about technologies before they're built. It makes no sense to sit here and wait and figure out, gosh, can facial recognition be used to harm people more than it helps? You can't have a serious conversation about technologies once they're built. But you can actually, and I would argue the most important thing we can be doing is saying you have to have a robust conversation about what you build before you build it. What are the questions that have to be asked? And that's where I think, gosh, the perspective we bring from the social sciences, from humanistic social sciences, are the questions that computer scientists and engineers should be trained to ask. They've just never had that training.
Mary, I wanted to build on sort of another side of this question and ask about, as a researcher in a social sciences researcher in an applied context, how does your positionality and the positionality of so many of the colleagues you admire shape the kinds of research that you do? Also building on a question from the chat, how do corporations build on this positionality and think about what it means to support their employees, other workers in less secure places, things like that?
Yeah, no, it's a really important question because it shapes, I would argue positionality shapes everything. Not in any definitive foreclosing way, but in terms of what do I consider important questions? How do I ask those questions? You know, I'm rooted in a specific kind of training, and I'm rooted in this body that's trained in particular ways. So any institutional context is just layering on that positionality. And actually, I love that you used that, Nima, because I think positionality as a concept would be a far more interesting concept to bring to the table than bias. You know, if you get in a debate about bias, there you actually get people thinking you can de-bias things. But if you get in a conversation about positionality, it means you're constantly calling the question of the intersectionality of many of our ways of being in the world. So this context, and I'll be more concrete because that question is probably asking, well, how does this institution shape my research agenda? doesn't it mean I'm not asking particular kinds of questions? Or maybe I'm incented to ask particular kinds of questions about products or services. I can remember like when I first moved to Microsoft Research, people asked me, well, what are you going to work on? Are you going to work on like new phones or, you know, improving PowerPoint? And I do confess I spent the first year I was here making sure people understood what I had written and what kind of research I do. I mostly at the time cared about queer identity formation and boundary publics and the lack of technology's capacity to address marginality. So I don't know that people, when I was first hired, fully understood what I was bringing, but I do think being in this setting at Microsoft Research as an industry setting allows me to ask the questions that I think are important. And what I have to constantly track is, has what I consider important changed because of where I am? Am I sidetracked? Do I feel sidetracked by that service teaching load of helping an engineer understand gender? I'm so tired some days of needing to explain gender or race or other constructed senses of self that have deep consequences. But it's a fair trade because that means in this setting, I can be that person who pushes someone who's never thought about those questions before. And that's worthwhile to me. But I think it's really important to be, I want people to keep asking me, is this place changing what you consider important? Any more so if I was at a university. I think that's the other little, every university is also a context. It's also a corporation in the United States.
Thank you, Mary. I'm gonna fold in one of the questions into the one I have. And this is related to setting standards in the industry. And you mentioned earlier briefly about like IPR and the tensions therewith. And I was wondering if you could speak a little more about, I guess, your observations about the tensions and relationships between, I guess, IPR and censorship that you've observed like, at the length of your being in Microsoft.
Yeah. You know, I think that, you know, the phrase censorship is subtle. Like all of this is happening through soft power. Like if I go back to the question about Google, and you know, I'd be the first to say in any workplace setting, things are probably really complicated where, you know, we can't always know what are all the complications, but there's kind of a simple reality of when you're in a research setting, if you're doing research, what are the expectations and the agreements that are in place for your room to do your work? And that's, you know, that I think for all of us to consider, if, you know, we're coming out of university training, what do we expect of each other? What is it that, what culture can we build that both pushes us all to ask questions like, did you get consent before you got that document? Like, does that become a basic question we always ask? And that we have a way of explaining when we don't have consent that is a genuine explanation instead of a defensive deflection. Like being able to come up with what are those core questions are the things that I think can address those places where we foreclose certain research agendas. So to the question of censorship, when I started asking questions about queer young people under 18, and I wanted to ask those questions and have waiver of parental consent, it was really hard to find other scholars who had done that work. And the reason most scholars were not doing that work, it was because it was discouraging to try and get through a review process. And that meant there were a lot of graduate students who were choosing to just work with people over 18 because that's just, God, you just want to move on. That to me is a failure of institutions. When we don't have much research on the lives of people because it's too inconvenient, then that's a place for us to collectively say, well, that's a loss. And it really does become this collective obligation rather than one individual's heralding it on to make sure certain kinds of lines of research get asked. I think that's even more true in industry settings. So if you don't see particular kinds of questions being asked, or you notice something consistent about what's absent from the publishing profile of particular industries, there's something going on there. And we all know there's no way to be in a tech industry-based research setting without reading the papers of people in university settings. So what can university settings be doing to say, enough? You're not going to be allowed to publish in our journals or participate in our proceedings if you aren't also willing to present work that's dealing with these difficult topics. Or if you're working with proprietary data, what access are you going to guarantee? Otherwise, you don't get to publish on it. If universities could make those strong requirements now, ethics reviews, nothing gets published without some version of an ethics review and tell me what that program involves. And it's not a legal review or a PR review. Like those kinds of things that I feel are ways to raise the bar. Because I'm not thinking tech companies are going away anytime soon. I'm just going to say that out loud. I think for the most part, people are still going to be using social media for a while. Like if we would all stop using it, these companies wouldn't exist. So there's some options there. But if these tech companies are going to continue, and if we're going to continue to live out parts of our social lives through these networked systems, we need a way to study society that recognizes how dependent social scientists and tech companies are on each other. Full stop.
Thank you.
Sure. I hope I'm not sounding too ranty.
No, you're good.
Okay.
So just to kind of build on what you said and to bring forward a question from the Q&A, can you talk a little bit about somebody mentioned, Connie McGuire mentioned community-based research as kind of encoding justice into knowledge production. And Connie asks if you could walk us through a process where in your work, maybe in the pandemic response work, that you have been able to build the bridge between the tech folks and the impacted communities. What does that look like on both all sides? And then also picking up on Willow Bauer's question, how do you ensure that trying to solve social issues with tech solutions isn't just another version of the white savior complex?
Yeah, oh, thank you. So if that's the Connie McGuire I know, hi Connie. So let me use Pandemic Response Network as an example, because I think it's an interesting one. If you think about the beginning of the pandemic, if you heard from tech companies, it was mostly like, let's build a digital tracing app. South Korea's got one, it seems to have worked. There was no awareness that perhaps the other things that might have helped make it work were universal health care in a very different relationship to citizenry and government and information sharing. Like everything I just said was just like a wait, what? But they have cell phones. So think about the beginning of that approach and the corrective, to use a concrete example, the corrective now is look at what it looks like to have a community healthcare worker who quite literally speaks the language of the person they're contacting and isn't just tasked with getting a list of contacts, but is actually building ongoing relationships with particular sets of people who need groceries, who need childcare, who need a host of other things that we don't consider part of caring for a patient. So it is blowing apart the idea of what constitutes patient care. And it's making a case that the domain experts who have to be in place are the people who best understand the circumstances, particularly if you're talking about communities of undocumented workers, for example, so that the extension of public health are the familiar faces who actually already provide a lot of support because the nation state has abandoned so many of those communities. So it's technologies that literally start from a premise of I'm building forward that relationship. I'm building out the trust that's already there. Digital tracing apps, the assumption was I need to protect healthy people from sick people. That's ridiculous in a pandemic. If you're not starting with how do I care for people who are sick, you're perpetuating a pandemic. And that's all we've done is perpetuate a pandemic. I mean, not just that. So it looks like, and why I'm hopeful, is that it obliterates the sense of my intuition or my own projection of what people need could ever possibly build something useful in any meaningful sense. It will literally just build something useful for me because that's what I've built. And it'll be a coincidence that other people adopt it because they had no other choice because that was the thing out and marketed. So it's letting go of assuming that something that has market share is meaningfully good. That's just bullshit. That was good marketing and usually obliterating your competitors. So it's thinking, walking through an example of not just user-centered design, but a socially aware approach to technologies. And that social sensibility is not the end all to be all. Like that is not the end. I think Bill said it earlier. It's like it's the beginning of this process of identifying more problems and taking them on and not getting defensive about it. Like we shouldn't be defensive that we are steeped in a structurally oppressive state of being. That is just, that's true. We perpetuate it. That's true. So move on, do something about it. Yeah.
Mary, we could have this conversation for the rest of the day and through the weekend, I think,
Yeah.
and unfortunately we can't. But I wonder if I might end just with one kind of final question, and we'll try to wrap it up. And I'm going to try to combine a couple of existing questions, but just to kind of bring it back to the university or bring it back to social science research. What in all of this process have you learned about the ways we need to change the university, or maybe the ways we need to change anthropology or social science, if you want to go slightly broader than anthropology?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm so glad you asked that question because I meant to say this earlier. The thing I've learned is that I was never trained to offer a possibility for moving forward. I was quite literally formally trained to go into a setting, fully comprehend what a shit show something was, point out what a shit show that is, and walk away. And I got more points if I could say it in an incredibly obtuse way. So the thing we have to change is assuming that we actually, as anthropologists and humanistic social scientists, and I mean particularly for qualitative researchers who spend time, who value longitudinal studies that assume time and space matters, that the most pressing thing we have to learn how to do is to translate what we've learned into, here's what we could do about it. And don't treat this as a solution. Treat it as an approach we could take. It's one of many possibilities. So we absolutely have to train ourselves to do that, because what's not working, particularly for people oriented to building things, is to tell people don't build things. It's like telling us don't study things. So, the thing that has to change for social sciences, and particularly for anthropology, qualitative sociology, critical studies of any kind, is we have to push ourselves to say, and so what would we do next with what we've learned? What would you recommend? Because if we can answer that and also have the capacity to say, and here are my other colleagues who could help fill out the answer, we will be more useful. So, but in terms of the university, we have to make room for being able to have interdisciplinary conversations. And what that means is I get points for going and learning technically what is artificial intelligence. I should know what that is before I critique it. I can't treat it as a metaphor any more than we ever should have treated AIDS as a metaphor. You have to understand what that is in the way that a domain expert is fluent in what that is, have literacy in what that is. And universities don't leave much room for that. And that's a collective loss.
That's an amazing place for us to kind of tie this conversation up. Thank you so much for joining us. I can't believe that an hour has gone by already. That was like the quickest, most productive hour I've had since the pandemic began. So thank you, Mary, for joining us. Thanks everybody else for being on the line. Thank you, Bill, for joining us. Thank you, Kim, Nina, and Nima for your questions and support. Mary, any final words before we sign off?
I think I might have mixed Kim and Nima, so apologies for that when you were asking questions. But thank you very much for the chance to be part of this series. I'm just so appreciative. This is, a real gift to scholars. So thank you.
Well, it's a gift reciprocated. So thanks very much for being here. And just to let everyone know, we are recording this conversation, and it will be up online for everyone who'd like to revisit, or who would like to who weren't here and would like to see the conversation. So thanks everyone again for being here, and thank you, Mary. I hope you enjoy your Friday afternoon.
Thank you. My pleasure. Good to see you all. Take care. Good
Thank
health.
you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you so much, Mary.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.